Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Lucy Birmingham with the Membership Marketing Committee. Tonight is our fourth Meet the Press in our seminar series with foreign correspondents. Tonight, we're very privileged to have Ken Moritsugu, the Japan Bureau Chief of Associated Press. So please give him a warm welcome. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction. It's always very interesting to see how a journalist's career has developed and where it's taken him. And Ken has been taken all over the world. It's fascinating. So I had a quick look at his LinkedIn page and learned that he started out at the Japan Times from 1984 to 1987. He then moved to Florida, where he was a reporter for the St. Petersburg Times until 1992, and coincidentally, my parents were subscribers just at that time, as they lived in St. Pete, which is kind of funny. Okay, he then joined Newsday until 2000. After this, he was a national correspondent for Knight Ridder in their Washington, D.C. bureau, and then in Delhi, India, as their special correspondent. He covered the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, among many other important news stories. From there, he joined AP, based in Bangkok, as their enterprise editor, responsible for a bunch of major projects. He was the lead editor in their award-winning multi-format, data-driven project called China's Reach, which, from what I understand, revealed how much more the world is trading with China than with the US. So perhaps this experience launched his digital expertise. And speaking of digital, his talk this evening is going to focus on AP in the digital age. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Great. Thank you, Lucy, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Foreign Correspondents Club for allowing me to speak here today. It's great to see so many people. I mean, I've already collected a whole bunch of name cards here, so it's great to meet so many new people and be able to talk to you a little bit about the Associated Press. I also wanted to just briefly thank my wife, who's in the audience, Carmen Chan, who's sitting over there. I was going to say I was trying to think of the proper word, behind every good journalist, there is a very patient spouse, because working in journalism can be a very unpredictable profession when news breaks on the weekends and so forth. And so to be the spouse of a journalist requires putting up with a lot of unexpected developments in life. And I was just thinking earlier today that we were having a house party. Actually, we're getting ready for a house party last fall, I think on a Saturday or Sunday, I think on a Saturday, when Mount Ontake erupted. Mm-hmm. So you can just imagine, like, you're trying to, I was supposed to help make food and and well, all that went out the window. I was working, she had to host everybody, and so every journalist has to appreciate the spouse in their life. Yay. So I guess maybe I'll just briefly tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Nikkei Sansei, so my grandparents were from Japan, from Western Japan, and they emigrated to Canada in I think the 1920s. My parents were both born in Canada. I was also born in Canada, but I only lived there for 2 years. And when we were quite young, my father, who's also a journalist, got a job in the U.S., so we moved to the U.S., and I grew up in the U.S., and I'm now a naturalized American citizen. So just a bit about my background. I'm going to use these slides here to help me kind of walk me through here. I thought I'd give a brief introduction to the AP and what the AP does globally and in Japan, so you guys, I'm sure you guys are fairly familiar with it already, so I hope it's not too basic. So we are a not-for-profit cooperative, which is owned by 1,400 U.S. newspapers. And not-for-profit doesn't mean we lose money. We still have to, break even or make money every year. But, all our profits go back, are reinvested into the company, into operations. We have no shareholders that we distribute money to. Our goal is to be an independent and objective news source with a strong commitment to freedom of the press, We want to deliver to a global audience the news of the world in as fair and objective way as possible. And freedom of the press is important for us in every country we operate. We really want the press to be able to speak freely, so to speak, to be able to not be constrained by government, and obviously from country to country that varies quite a bit, and we encounter a lot of challenging situations that we have to deal with, maybe on a day-to-day basis, but regularly every year. Today we have journalists in 110 countries, and we deliver our, what we now call content in the internet age in text, video, and photos to customers around the world. A little bit of history about the AP in Japan. And I just had to look. I had to look this up. I don't really know this, but apparently we actually had a reporter here around the time of the Russo-Japanese War, and the record is that the reporter actually rowed the ship that brought the Japanese diplomats to, I think it was Portsmouth, New Hampshire, eventually, for the treaty ending the Russo-Japanese War. So that was sort of the first, it wasn't an official presence, so to speak, but an AP reporter was in Japan. And I believe that same reporter was still here in 1923 when the great earthquake hit, the Kanto earthquake, also covered that. In 1933 was our first partnership in Japan with Kyoto's predecessor, Nippon Shimbun Rengo. And then obviously in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, we were kicked out of Japan. We had to leave. And we came back with the surrender, the official surrender with the USS Missouri. And the reason I put this New York Times article up here is you can't see it, but the article on the very right, which is the lead article that says "War comes to end," if the fine print, it says by the Associated Press. So it was our correspondent who was on the ship, was actually able to file a story that day about the surrender. So I'll jump a bit ahead to what we do cover in Japan today. Our main sort of meat and our traditional journalism is general news, things that happen in the news. And obviously we covered this story last week, which was the debate over and the vote on the security legislation. I chose this, I just showing you the top of a story because I can't show you the whole story, but I chose this particular Q&A format because a lot of what we do is try to explain to readers outside of Japan what is happening, because they may not be familiar with the issue, they may have vaguely followed it, may have not followed it at all over the last 6 months or a year, and all of a sudden there's people shouting in Parliament, people walking out, protesters marching around the Diet, and so forth. So we often, not often, but from time to time when there's a major story, we'll do a Q&A that attempts to walk a foreign audience through exactly what is happening here, what's the debate about, sort of thing. Other general news stories we cover, obviously, as I mentioned, disasters like volcanoes and earthquakes and major typhoons. We cover things like the Shinkansen, the person who set himself on fire in the Shinkansen. That obviously, I would say everybody, but a lot of people in the world know about the bullet train, and so when something like that happens, it's a news story, and we covered it quite closely, and we even sent a photographer and a video journalist to where was the station? They went to film the people as they were coming up. We weren't able, obviously, to be at the scene because we're in Tokyo and couldn't get there that quickly. But we almost immediately put journalists in a car and they drove down there to cover that. And then we came back and followed up later in the week with a look at safety on the bullet train in Japan and sort of the debate that emerged about, should there be more security, should there be checks of luggage or not, and that kind of thing. I'll move to business and technology, which is probably what a lot of you in the audience are interested in. And I chose Pepper, the robot, which is just partly because it's cute, but also because we do focus quite a bit on technology and particularly I'm not sure how to phrase, sort of consumer-friendly or human technology that appeals to human beings and readers around the world, sort of thing. So let me take a step back and say that our business coverage is a little different than, say, Reuters or Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones, which are financially oriented organizations, and a lot of their customers are investors, right? They're delivering news to the world, but they're making a lot of the money they're making is by delivering news to investors, and they want all kinds of market-moving information on every company and every little thing that happens. And we don't try to compete in that space. It's sort of a different model for journalism. What we like to say is our business coverage is oriented towards the global consumer. So we're writing stories for consumers. So if we're going to write a business story, we're going to want to tell you how that business story affects you or affects consumers around the world. And I said consumers, but it's not just consumers, but it's also a workplace issue, how it affects workers around the world. So we're interested in issues like womanomics and work hours and retirement, pension, living in retirement, and are people able to afford retirement and so forth. These are all issues that are kind of human issues that people everywhere care about, and so these are the kind of issues that we focus on. And in terms of business stories, we'll obviously, as I mentioned, we'll do the robot story. We do a fair amount of robot stories because people are interested in robots. They like to read about them. We also do things like the Takata airbag problem, because that affects a lot of people everywhere in the world, and particularly in America, it was a very big story because there were several accidents in America involving Takata airbags. We cover stuff like that. So it's sort of a broad range of things, but I guess we don't cover the more businessy stuff. And we obviously cover the Japanese economy and GDP and markets at a certain level. But we really, when we write a story, we think about, well, how is this going to affect, the refrigerator you want to buy, or the TV you want to buy, or how's this going to affect, or is this a story about, living in an era when, both parents have to work to support a family, and how does that play out in, say, in Japan compared to the US and other countries in the world? Sports is another big thing, and this happens to be the controversy of last week, so I put it up here. This is actually a story I did on shortly before the Prime Minister came out to announce they were going to revisit the whole issue on how this stadium, if it had actually been built, would probably have been the most expensive stadium ever built anywhere in the world. And I did a little research, and I think at this point the most expensive stadium in the world is in New Jersey. It's the football stadium for the New York Jets and New York Giants outside of New York City, and it cost $1.6 billion to build. And as you know, the estimates for this one are up in the $2 billion range. So it's kind of a eye-catching thing to me. I was kind of surprised that it was really that expensive, sort of thing. So we do stories like that, but we also we cover sports in Japan. Now we cover sports globally, and we don't. So our market, you have to think about our market is really outside Japan. So we cover the sports that are of interest to our audience that's outside of Japan. So what does that mean? It tends to mean things like tennis. We cover tennis. Everyone's interested in tennis. Figure skating is quite big. We actually cover football, soccer or football. So we cover J-League. And then we tend to do more feature stories on, say, foreign wrestlers in sumo. We did a story on old or elderly athletes in Japan, how Japan had a large number of people who were, say, in their 50s and 60s and still competing professionally. And so that kind of more human interest kind of story. And the final part of our mix is entertainment news, which I think in general has become a big part of a lot of news organizations' coverage in the last decade or so. And here I just put up a photo because I think in entertainment it's really often largely a visual story. I mean, it's all about the, whether it's the Hollywood stars or in this case, Gojira, Godzilla sort of thing coming out. There's a huge appetite for these kinds of stories around the world. Our entertainment coverage in Japan is somewhat more limited. I mean, we're looking at stories that are going to appeal to people outside of Japan. So, I mean, Godzilla is one, obviously, but we do occasionally do stuff on anime and manga, because that's of interest outside of Japan. A bit on, I don't know, we will report on AKB-48 once in a long while, not regularly, but there are people around, even in the US who've heard of AKB-48 and follow this stuff, so we'll do that too. So let me now just kind of shift to what I promised to talk about, which is the kind of digital revolution that's affecting all of us in media here in Japan, as well as in the US and around the world. And my first point is really that this is not the first revolution in media. When AP started, the only way to get news besides a letter someone mailed to you was a newspaper. There was nothing else except the newspapers. Eventually, the first real revolution was broadcast. So we had first radio, and then what really had a huge impact was television. It really changed the media world, the way news is delivered. And now and then I should add, we had the birth of CNN and 24-hour news, which again sort of added a new element to the way news is covered around the world and learned about. And so the current revolution is really the digital revolution, for lack of a better word, sort of all-encompassing word. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but just to walk you through quickly AP's evolution. So we started in 1846 as what we call text service. We were providing, and we weren't actually a service in those days. So what happened was there was U.S. invaded Mexico. I know the U.S. likes to invade countries. So the U.S. invaded Mexico in 1846, and for the newspapers in New York, this was a really competitive story. They wanted to get the news first and to their readers first, kind of thing. And in those days, the telegraph had just started. And the telegraph, I think, went from New York or Boston as far south as like Baltimore or something like that, around Washington, D.C. Then from Washington, D.C. to essentially the south, which is where this news was coming from, Mexico to New Orleans, it had to get usually by horse, by what was called in the U.S. the Pony Express, by mail to Baltimore to telegraph it on, sort of thing. And these newspapers wanted to beat the mail service. It would be faster than the postal service. So they developed their own Pony Express that could outdo the mail service and get them news 24 hours ahead of the competition. And that was essentially the birth of the Associated Press. It evolved, obviously, over the years and became an actual provider of content, writer of stories. In 1935 is when we first started sending photos by wire, wire being sort of a cable that went into the newspaper, in those days monthly newspapers' offices, so they could receive AP photos from around the world. In 1994, we moved into video in a big way. We launched a global video service, and that continues to be a major focus for us today, delivering video both for online and broadcast clients. And then finally, the digital revolution. We launched our AP Mobile, our mobile app, in 2008. And so that's sort of us joining the digital age. Just briefly, I thought this might be of some interest if you haven't seen this, sort of the difference between the US and Japan at this point and sort of this move to digital journalism. So as you can see here, television remains strong in both the US and Japan. More so in Japan, and TV broadcasters are seeing some erosion in the U.S. And you can see the internet is, on a percentage basis, twice as big as in Japan in terms of where people get their news from. And you can also see how small newspapers have become in America. Newspapers in Japan are still relatively strong. And according to this poll, they're going head-to-head with the internet at this point in terms of where people get their news from. Just one little side note is, one reason why Japan is probably like this compared to America is Japan is older than America, right? So older people tend to read newspapers and be less familiar with using the internet. So it's a little bit skewed in that way. So what does this all mean for us in the media industry and for the AP? Well, the digital editor is both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge. I'm sure many of you have heard the stories about the financial pressures that what we call traditional media companies, newspapers, and now broadcasters as well are under in America and Europe and increasingly in Japan as well, as People, no longer have to rely. The so-called traditional media no longer have a monopoly on the news. You can get your news from so many sources today without picking up a newspaper, without even watching NHK, right, or the news on television. You can get news from websites. You can get news via Twitter. You can get news even via Facebook nowadays. So it's really sort of it's taken away our monopoly and therefore made it harder for us to generate the revenue we need to produce news, which basically means to hire journalists to cover the news and deliver it to you. The flip side is it's an opportunity, and I mean, to be honest, it's also a sort of survival situation. We need to survive, and so in order to survive, there are new ways to we can take advantage of some of these digital technologies to develop new ways to deliver information to our audience, our customers around the world, and the mobile app is one example of that, right? And we often talk about what's trending now on social media, on Twitter, and that's often. We try not to be overwhelmed by what's trending, but we can't ignore it as journalists, whatever the hot topic of the day is, even if it's not the most serious topic in the world. But I just wanted to mention these are not trending on social media. These are two trends that I think at least the U.S. media industry, I think it's just the U.S., are focused on right now. One is social media, the increasing use of social media as a gateway for people to get to the news. So if you remember, in the old days, people got a newspaper to get the news. Then they watched the evening news to get the news. Maybe they watched the morning news to get the news. Then they watched CNN 24 hours a day to get the news, kind of thing. Then when the internet first started, they went to the homepage of a media company, of the New York Times, or maybe, I don't know what it's like in Japan, but maybe of Yomiuri Shimbun to get the news. Now people don't go to the home pages of these companies. They see things on Twitter or Facebook. They see links and click on them and get to the stories. So we have to really be cognizant of that's the way that increasingly the world is accessing news, and getting to what we hope are our stories, but our competitors' stories as well. So how do we capture that market is something that I think everybody in the industry is thinking about. The second thing is mobile, is that I mentioned before the homepage and the internet, and it's sort of this not semi-famous story in the U.S. is the New York Times invested a lot of money into developing their homepage. They thought this is the future. No one's going to read the newspaper anymore. They're going to come to our homepage, and we have to have this designed in a really attractive and impressive way. It's going to draw people in and make them click on these stories and stay on our site and not go somewhere else. They invested all this money, and then the world changed on them, because now people, increasingly people are reading news on their mobile phones and on their tablets. They're not bothering to go to the homepage. And there was I don't know, the statistic is I think 50% of the New York Times' digital traffic is on mobile. So half of it is on mobile, the other half is on the internet, sort of thing. And they even had this funny experiment a month or two ago. For 1 week in their office, if you worked at the New York Times and you tried to go to their internet site, www.newyorktimes.com, you got a message that this site is inaccessible. Check out the New York Times on mobile. So this is only for employees within the company, but for 1 week they wanted to reinforce to employees that this is our future. You need to think about how your story looks like on a tablet, on the mobile phone, not how it looks like in a newspaper, not how it looks like even on the on the homepage, on the internet, kind of thing. So that's the other sort of thing that's affecting a lot of us. I mean, to break it down a bit, just I don't know how much you are in this, but during the weekdays, traffic is higher on the internet because people are at the office and they're using their computers and reading stuff on the internet. During the weekends, it's higher on mobile because you don't have your PC or your laptop open. You just have your phone or your tablet and you're reading stuff kind of. So but anyway, those are two things that are happening that we are all focused on, and how are we going to capture these markets. And we have a lot of competition. Facebook wants to take all that away from us in a way. I mean, they're so powerful that we can't ignore them. We have to partner with them and work with them. And even if they're going to erode some of our market, we can't be we can't be a player because they have such a base of people that they can draw on that to not it would be, I don't know if it'd be suicidal, but it wouldn't be wise not to engage with them. So I'll just wrap up here by, this is our AP, a little bit of an advertisement. This is our AP mobile app, which is free. You can download it for free. It has more than 13 million downloads. It's one of the more popular news sites in the world. It's not in Japanese, I'm sorry, only in English and Spanish. And just this is how it's now designed. This is the top half. You can scroll down, kind of thing. So, I mean, we'll have like the top news story. This is from 2 weeks ago, maybe. So the top news story was the Greek financial crisis. I don't know if you can see that on there. That's actually a Greek flag being waved by someone in front of the Greek parliament, I presume. This top sports story happened to be the Women's World Cup. That's the Americans winning the Women's World Cup. The entertainment story I can't speak for. I have no idea why that very good-looking man is there, but it must have been a big story in entertainment. And then, I'll just briefly, 22 Years a Slave is, often when I talk to other audiences, I mean, I like to impress on them that, yes, we're doing all this stuff for the digital age. We're doing all this kind of very punchy social media, Facebook, not necessarily Facebook, Twitter-oriented kind of journalism. But we also want to remain true to our sort of roots and tradition of in-depth investigative journalism. I think the news media in general wants to do that globally. And AP was always more of a news service than an investigative news organization. But even the AP, I think, because of the competition now that exists in the media industry, in order to survive, we need to deliver unique content to people, so people will buy it from us, basically, at the end of the day. And so we still do, and we increasingly do, sort of more in-depth investigative stuff. And this 20 Years a Slave is quite at least for a journalist, quite an impressive series that we've been doing in Southeast Asia. And it's about slave labor in the fishing industry in Southeast Asia, and basically how all the fish that are caught in, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of the fish that are caught in Southeast Asia that end up in Japan, in the U.S., and around the world, they're often on Thai fish, not always Thailand, often Thai fishing boats that are employing Burmese, Myanmarese, or others from very poor countries in virtual slave-like conditions. And this was something that was kind of known, and certainly activist groups talked about it and complained about it. But it's a very hard story to verify, right? And I think the journalists who worked on this are two women, both Americans, who one was based in Myanmar and one was based in Indonesia, probably spent 6 or 7 months just to get the first story out, which was they actually found an island in Indonesia where there were 40 or 50, I don't remember the number, slaves living in almost prison-like conditions. I mean, fishermen who weren't allowed to go home to Myanmar. They were kind of almost, some of them, they were in cages, but they were locked up. They weren't allowed to communicate, they weren't allowed to get out. And they were able to find these people to go there. They actually went, in the end, with the Indonesian government, which freed them, sort of thing. So that was the start of this series, and we've been following this for several months now, and this happens to be, we're featuring this story that happens to be the story of one person from Myanmar who went back. So we followed him back from Indonesia to Myanmar and his homecoming after, 8 or 9 years being away from home, seeing his mom again for the first time, that kind of thing. So, not to be somber at the end, but just want to emphasize that we try to do, investigative and in-depth journalism, as well as all the other stuff we're doing for the internet today. So that's what I had to say. You're welcome to contact me at any time via Twitter or email.
Okay, Ken, thank you so much. It's so interesting. AP is an amazing organization. All right, so now let's open the floor up to some questions. We've got a Q&A period for the next 30 minutes, and after that, from 8 o'clock, we will enjoy some dinner, and you'll be able to mix with Ken and ask him questions directly if you don't want to ask any now. So anybody has a question that they'd like to ask? Yes, please. Yeah, and please come up and give us your name or identify yourself. Oops. Oh, we need to lift that up.
That's all right.
Or you want the hand up.
That's good. Oh, hi, my name's Louis Krause. It's good to see you again. I work for Japan's Subculture Research Center, and I worked at the Baltimore Sun last year, and I'm just a college student visiting. I guess I wanted to ask a little bit what your thoughts are about involving like Twitter and stuff, because it seems like it would be a little frustrating because there's such a lack of like good grammar or punctuation in all the tweets people make, and like when you look at Facebook and stuff. So how do you like combat the fact that it's so like unofficial seeming and I don't know, very not like a newspaper that's so official? And I guess another question would just be like, sorry, I forgot my question.
Okay, well, I'll answer that one if you think of it. So I think in terms of Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, people obviously write in very abbreviated ways and often in ungrammatical ways, I suppose. I don't think it bothers us personally. I mean, we still try to be grammatical in what we tweet. Obviously, we do have to fit it into the limitations of what a tweet is, and we abbreviate things the way everybody else abbreviates things. Maybe not to the full extent everybody else abbreviates things, but to a certain extent, we obviously have to abbreviate things as well. Since you brought up Twitter, I think one thing talking about how the media has changed. If you think about it now, it's very hard for us as a news organization to be the first to tell you the news, because you're going to have heard about it on Twitter somehow in a way. And what I'm thinking was, so suppose right now a bomb went off at Tokyo Station, right? So within seconds, if not minutes, there'd be tweets. Big explosion at Tokyo Station, smoke coming out of Tokyo Station, police coming massing at Tokyo Station. So something has happened at Tokyo Station. That used to be what we delivered to you. We used to tell you, hey, something's happening at Tokyo Station. We still put out news alerts, and we still do that. But we've, in a sense, we had to seed that ground of being first to the greater public of the world, because they're able to do that via Twitter. So, what we hope is our value added is that, if we're going to provide you with verified, for lack of better, true information, right? So, in Twitter, when something happens, there's a lot of information. Some of it ends up being true, some ends up being false. We hope that people will look at the AP when they see AP tweet it or do a story about it, to know that, well, this really happened, or this is what actually happened, kind of thing. And not that we're perfect, not that we don't make mistakes, as everybody makes mistakes in this world, but we really try hard to be right. And there's this intense pressure to be fast, but we always say we'd rather be number 2 and right than number 1 and wrong, kind of thing. And there have been stories in the past where, there are stories where our competitors are faster than us. There are other stories where our competitors were faster than us, but they reported stuff that was just kind of hearsay and rumor and turned out not to be true. And we don't want to do that. We want you to look at us as delivering you, sort of verified, reliable information.
Cool. Can I ask my other question?
Sure.
I wanted to ask, it's like, I guess when you're in Japan, I would guess you're more so writing for things like New York Times or bigger newspapers, but like, do you have experience at all with like working with the smaller newspapers that try to mix in more local stories, and like how do you balance like fitting in AP stories into smaller newspapers, like in terms of like papers like the Baltimore Sun where I worked, where you could kind of tell it was like a slow news day if you get a bunch of AP stories that are just like international tennis events or something like that. So like, can you talk about that at all?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding your question.
Just like, do you get pressure to like not really push your articles into more local newspapers or anything like that?
No, I think our customers, as I said, first of all, our owners are actually 1,400 U.S. newspapers. Practically every newspaper in the U.S. is technically one of our owners, and they elect our board. And we work, I guess, in different ways to serve clients of different sizes, and we're certainly looking at a global market now, and if anywhere our growth is internationally, it's not in the U.S. The U.S. is a fairly stagnant, if not shrinking, market for us, and so we're looking to places like Asia, as well as Latin America for growth. But yeah, so take a step back. I don't want to get too far off the topic here, but just in the U.S. market, we are and we position ourselves, and we think we are an extremely needed source of news for local newspapers around the U.S. And we have a very strong, what we call, state news service, covering news of the state, of that particular state, like a prefecture in Japan, for the newspapers within that state. We have reporters in every state house. All 50 state houses have an AP reporter. So if you're a small newspaper that doesn't have your own state house correspondent, you can get our state news from us. I'll divert a little bit into, this is something of more general interest. We're doing something called automated stories, which is essentially stories produced. I mean, the lingo is robo-journalism, although we don't call it that officially. But stories produced essentially by a computer. So what does that mean? We're doing this for quarterly earnings reports for companies. So when a company reports, profits up, profits down, losses, and we have a partnership with a financial information company that does this kind of analysis and puts all this information into an Excel, essentially an Excel spreadsheet, puts all the figures in. That information is then fed into a software program that was developed by a company called Automated Insights, which developed this business, and we actually invested in as a company initially, though we've sold our interest in them. And we had then helped them develop, I think, 8 templates for stories based on profits up, profits down, beat expectations, didn't beat expectations, And in so doing, before we had the staff in the U.S. to do 300 quarterly earnings reports, and now we're doing 4,500 quarterly earnings reports. Now, these are not long stories. These are maybe 200 words, 150, 200 word stories. They're brief stories, but we're covering virtually every company in the U.S. and now in Canada. We started in Canada. We want to expand to Europe as well, to Asia eventually, if we're able to do it. And what this means for a small town newspaper in, say, Tennessee is all of a sudden they have earnings reports for every company in Tennessee. And they, with their few reporters, they don't have to run around doing all those earnings reports. So we're providing this kind of service to local newspapers, as well as sort of, serving bigger clients in different ways.
All right. Anybody questions? Anybody else? Don't be shy. I think we've got a bunch of corporate public relations people here who I think would be very interested in learning how they can connect with AP, different ways that they can do that. What's the best way for them to do that, do you think?
Well, I think it depends on the story, but I suppose email is the best way these days. I mean, we still have a fax machine, and we still get a lot of faxes, and we don't read them all because we get too many, and we don't have enough people to read all the faxes. I think the main advice, I guess, I would give to people trying to reach the news media and reach the AP is, so we've always been very busy. But as I've mentioned, the media industry in the U.S. And globally is under a lot of financial pressure, which means we're smaller than we used to be. So we have fewer staff in Tokyo and other places than we did in 2008, basically since the financial crisis, the Lehman shock, and so forth. The industry has shrunk quite a bit. So we don't have someone to read faxes anymore, for example. So we're all busy. We're all trying to do good stories. We want to spend our time focused on stories. So if you want to get my attention, be both attention-grabbing and brief and concise. Like, don't send me 10 pages of something that I need to read. And if you think about how journalism whether it's in text or on television is presented, we have what's called the lead of the story. Like the most grabbing, important part of the story is the first sentence. Now you don't have to do that in every press release, but the first sentence or paragraph is what's going to determine whether I keep reading the rest of that press release or just say, I'm not sure this is interesting, I don't have time for this, and set it aside. So really focus on getting my attention, quickly would be my general advice.
And the quickest way to do that is to write a really strong lead. Is that what you're saying? I mean, how?
I'd say a strong or a catchy lead, something that's kind of, think about when you tell, I give the same advice to journalists on my staff, whether they're video journalists or writers. Think about how you tell a story to your best friend or your parent or your mom or dad or your spouse. Like, you don't have a long introduction and all this background and da-da-da-da. You just say, hey, did you hear what happened today? My company, did this, something, that kind of thing. Just like, you don't have to, obviously you don't want to be that conversational, but just sort of hit me with something very sort of grabbing. And I'll say, wow, okay, I want to know more about this, and I want to keep reading, sort of thing.
How about visuals? Should they send you photos or video, or how can they really grab you?
Yeah, I guess a good photo works. We don't get that many photos, but yeah, if it's a visual story, we look at some stories as being more visual. We call them visually driven stories, and some stories are more traditional text stories, kind of thing. And on sort of the softer side of things, we did recently. Our video crew went to Fuji's Safari Park to film. Some of you may have seen this on the Japanese news. These elephants in a swimming pool, essentially. So they built a area for the elephants to swim, which was probably a good idea because elephants probably like to swim, and this actually increased their appetite and gave them something to do. They're probably bored walking around a safari park. But they also built it in a way that there's sort of a glass wall on one side, and you can see the elephants swimming inside. It's not a huge story, but when you see that image, like, wow, that's kind of cool. I didn't know elephants could swim, or a lot of people sort of thought that kind of thing, and that was quite a. So yeah, if you're going to try to sell me on a story like that, I think an image like that would be like, wow. I would just like stop and say, I gotta know. I want to know more about this kind of thing.
Okay, thanks. Okay, any questions? Anybody? Yes, Joan. Have Joan, and then the next gentleman.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. My name's Joan Anderson, working for Soka Gakkai International, and I'm interested in how if you're looking at creating catchy stories that will appeal to people in terms of maybe sharing links on Facebook, for example, there's a fine line between, providing something interesting and sort of slipping over the edge into sensationalism and really sort of manipulating the reader or user in a way that they then feel rather irritated about. So I'm just interested in how you make judgments about what kind of headline to put on a story or
sure.
whatever.
I think it's a constantly evolving process at all organizations, right? And how do we? It is a fine line. We're not. So if you think about it, there are in the U.S. and now some internationally, there are websites like BuzzFeed, which draw a young audience in a very effective way, and are essentially competing with more traditional news organizations for audience these days, right? So how do we compete with that? Well, we don't want to be BuzzFeed, obviously. That's a little bit not the direction we want to go in, or actually not the direction we want to go in, but we want to go that far. But I think it's a constantly evolving kind of thing where our headlines are definitely more provocative than they used to be. But one thing that I don't like and we don't do this too much, is headlines that are questions. They want you to click on that so you can find out the answer to the question, and it's kind of cheating because they know the answer. They could tell you the answer, but if they told you the answer, you might not click on it and read it, right? So, we probably don't go that far, but, I think we think a lot about maybe writing clever headlines, and that's not necessarily something new to journalism. I think whether, particularly tabloid journalism around the world, but even, I think, like the Baltimore Sun, way before the digital era would have been tried to write catchy headlines, There was, this is a long time, even, I'm not this old, but there was a time when New York City was going bankrupt in, I can't remember, 1970s, I guess. And they had appealed to the US federal government for a bailout, and the US said no. So the headline on, if I recall this correctly, the headline in the New York Daily News, which is a tabloid newspaper, was Ford to New York dropped dead. Like Ford to New York, just forget it, dropped dead. This was way before the internet, right? This is the way that newspapers always these sort of newspapers being sold at the newsstand, they wanted you to buy that newspaper as an impulse buy kind of thing. And so I don't think it's that completely new for us to try to draw you in. I mean, I spoke recently to a group of university students who were sort of debating the media, and they said, well, do you provide the news that people want, or the news that you think people need, right? This is one of those big debates that are going on. If people only want news about celebrities, is that all we're going to produce? Kind of thing. Well, obviously not, sort of thing. So, this is a bit of a quip, but the way I answered it was that I think we want to make you want the news you need, right? So if we're going to write about politics or security issues or these topics that we think are important for informed citizens to know about, we need to write about them in ways that are going to want to make you click on it and read that story, right? So, is it sensationalizing? I don't know. I mean, it's making, it's drawing you into the story. It's telling you the story in a way that's lively enough. It's not written like a government report or an academic paper, and also in a sort of very understandable, comprehensible way for people who aren't experts in the topic.
Okay, and this gentleman here, could you just let us know your name and?
Yes, my name is Ted Khan from Wacom. I understand you covered a lot of stuff compared with Bloomberg and Reuters and kind of stuff, because you need to cover generations as well. And I think this is great. But on the other hand, you mentioned that you are working on you're working on short-handed stuff on your bureau. I think this is kind of contradictory. If you like, you need to cover a lot of stuff, but short-handed. How do you cope with that? And if there is anything, people from corporate communications help you guys do the job better, I'd like to know.
Well, the first part of that question is, we obviously have to be selective about what we cover. We can't cover everything, right? So. And I think that what we've actually done internally as a company is looked at what our customers use, what stories our customers using. And if our customers aren't using them, we've stopped doing them. So I think if you were to look at, say, AP's coverage of Japanese politics today versus 20 years ago, you would find a lot fewer stories. Because, at the end of the day, the rest of the world isn't that interested in the internal inside baseball of Japanese politics and the parties and the factions and what's going on, sort of thing. I mean, it's interesting as someone who's interested in Japan to know about this stuff, and it's still interesting to do sort of maybe a once in a while kind of a explanation or analysis or even investigation into, say, the Japanese political system and what it means, sort of thing. But sort of a lot of the day-to-day stuff we just don't cover. But we've also found that our customers didn't really want that. We were almost doing too much in a way. And what we really try to do more and more of is focus on the journalism that what we call is distinctive. That is what other people aren't doing. Or if they're doing the same story, we're going to do it in a different way, and hopefully, we hope in a better way. If you I mean, the automated stories I told you about are very much a big part of this, right? So in the U.S., because of our business staff got smaller, I told you we could only do 300 quarterly earnings reports. And it also meant that our now shrunk, our limited business writers were focused on spending their time writing these quarterly earnings reports, which aren't very interesting stories. I mean, they're all what we call commodity journalism at a certain level. They're just, they're numbers and up and down, and analyst says this and da 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 da. And at the end of the day, everybody else is doing this too. Reuters is doing this, Bloomberg is doing this. You can find this out yourself by going on the internet today and doing this. So it's not going to work for the AP to have its limited staff doing those stories. So, I mean, that's why we're doing things like the automated journalism, so we can still do them at a certain level and then take our staff and write the more in-depth, interesting story about Apple or General Motors or Citibank or whatever kind of thing. And I should just so you don't misunderstand me, we still do, for the 80 or 90 sort of most important companies in America, we still have a reporter write an earnings report, a story every quarter sort of thing. So we haven't completely eliminated, we're not totally automated on that, but that's one way to sort of produce, to remain comprehensive without, using up all our very limited resources kind of thing.
Okay. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Motoko. I'm a reporter for Radio New Zealand, and I'm also a press officer for a space research institute at the University of Tokyo. My role as a press officer, I have a very difficult role. I want to be able to give journalists enough information that they can write a good story. But I also understand that you need to get the news out fast. So I need to make sure I don't give you too much information that you're bogged down for a long time. And so my question to you is, for a typical story at AP, how much time do you have to do the research and to write your story up?
It totally varies depending on the story. But the first thing I'd say about your dilemma is, whether it's an email. One thing that email makes easy is you can have a very short, brief email giving you the highlights of the story. Then you can have all the attachments. You can attach the 20 or 30 page document that has all the details, and will keep the reporter from calling you to ask you all the details, which saves you time too, sort of thing. So I think, the strategy I would adopt, and you probably do this already, is to sort of have again, think about the headline, right? The subject line of the email should grab me, make me want to click on that email, open that email and read it, and then have a short, I don't know what, in English it would be maybe 300 word kind of summary with a great photo if it's visually photo. But then you can have attachments that have PDFs with all the details that the reporter is going to have all these questions. They can just go and look it up, and then I think that would work for me. I could, and it's so much more helpful to actually have those PDFs than not to have to think, oh, that's true, but what does this really mean? Or how big was this 5 years ago versus today? And if that information is all there and I can just collect it, otherwise I have to either look for it on the internet, or then I have to email you and wait for you to respond to me, then you have to look it up, and then it's the kind of thing. So how much time do you have for a typical story? Okay. Well, tell me, what kind of story do you have in mind? You have a breaking news story, or like an earthquake, or like the vote in Parliament on the thing, or more like a feature story on, I don't know, a space exploration project?
Well, I guess most of the stories that we come out would be a new study coming out in an international journal, which is some kind of, it could either be, most of the times it's a development in some place. Ones that I'm working on right now are they're on big topics like dark matter and Big Bang theory and inflation, but they're not exactly worthy for, I guess, a feature. So I'd be looking at something that's quite small but big enough to say that scientists have been working on this.
So usually if it's going to be published in a journal, and in AP's case, we're probably not going to write about it unless it gets published in a journal. We kind of let the journals be our arbiter of what is research that's been accepted by the scientific community or not. And as we learned in Japan, that's not always a good and effective arbiter. But but if it's going to be published in a journal, it's going to come in a journal. We need to put out a story the day it's published, usually, right? Because it's news. It's going out to the world. And with the journals, they often give us embargoed copies of the research, and so we have a week or so to work on it, to kind of maybe even do interviews with some of the researchers, something like that ahead of time. Just have a story ready to, it's for release. They'll tell you a time, at 0900 GMT on Tuesday, and we can just write the whole story. And when the time comes, nowadays we can program the system to just put the story out at 9 GMT sort of thing. But so how much time we have depends on when you give it to us, I guess. But we have to publish on that day usually because that's when the news is, kind of thing. It's possible if it's interesting enough, we could come back a week or two later and do a bigger story on it. But we would, particularly I think in this internet era, feel some sort of pressure to get it out when people are talking about it, when people are tweeting about it, sort of thing.
Oh, that's very helpful. Okay, anybody else? No more questions? Yes, please. Here, Kobayashi-san.
Furukawa, freelance, a regular member of 43 years. My question is, in my analysis and from my experience, in Japan, there are 4 groups or segments, or shall we say, layers of newspapers. The first is, as you know, the general newspapers. Then there are business or economic newspapers. Then down the road, there are what we call industry newspapers, like chemical, petrochemical, machinery. Then all the way down, we have what we call trade newspapers, like textile, apparel, fashion, sort of. Now, it seems to me that, for instance, Reuters was very successful because it specialized in business news until Bloomberg came along, in my view. My question is, how is the AP positioned in covering all these segments of industry and business? Are you more interested or more or less specialized in business news or more general newspaper? What you seem that the more you become specialized, the more profit, although on a smaller scale. So what is your policy on these segments we have?
Sure, that's a good question. I think, as I said before, we're not trying to compete with Reuters or Bloomberg in that space. I mean, they have a very, as you described, a very well-defined market that they're going after. It's a very competitive market. They have competitors outside them, besides themselves as well today, and so it's challenging for them as well, I think, in a lot of ways. In terms of what, I said this a little bit earlier, in terms of what we do for business news. So our readers, think about general news and business news, our readers are not generally investors, are not people looking to us for investment information. So we're, as I said earlier, we're writing for the general audience, what we call the general consumer, right? So if we're going to write business stories, say, anywhere in the world, we're going to be thinking about stories that affect, for lack of a better, regular people's lives, right? And I mentioned an example before of like, how is this development at this company going to affect, price of televisions or something like that? That's the kind of thing that matters to our readers, sort of thing. So I think it's, I guess the way I'd put it is we cover business news more as a general news kind of topic, right? So what does the non-investor person out there want to know about business? Because business affects everybody, right? Business affects you in terms of, the products you can buy. It affects, we all work for businesses, or most of us do. So, workplace issues are important to us. And we just zero in on those areas and kind of leave the more trade and financial stuff to Reuters and Bloomberg.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I have one quick question.
Sure.
For AP Japan, what stories do the customers use?
You mean stories out of Japan?
Yeah.
Okay, around the world. It's interesting. I mean, there are different ways to measure this, right? And one thing that I always want to be careful about is not to be overtaken by the digital age. So, we look at things like what on our mobile app, which stories get the most clicks and the most, are read the most, sort of thing. And those tend to be, not necessarily lighter stories, but the more, I don't know, somehow they just sort of jump out of you. They're not the stories like politics or even the security legislation in Japan. I mean, they get some interest. I think if you put, talking about headlines, if you put China in the headline, it'll get clicks, as opposed to if you're just writing about Japan and security policy. I think if you put it in that context, because people in the world everyone's thinking about China now and what is China doing militarily. So what does get clicks are things like the solar plane landing in Japan. The solar plane had an emergency landing in Japan. Everyone wants to know about that. What's going on? Right? I mean, Godzilla stories, as I mentioned, get clicks. The Shinkansen fire story got a fair number of clicks. Natural disasters, the volcanoes and earthquakes. People always want to know about those. So what I wanted to emphasize to you was that's sort of just one. Although I'm pushing digital because we all have to think digital. That's just one part of our market, right? And if all we did was write to the clicks, we would just be writing those kinds of stories, right? And there is also a market for more, for lack of a better word, more serious, in-depth kind of journalism. And so our customers range from newspapers to websites, to very specialized websites that want to broadcasters, who all want information in different ways. So we have such a broad customer base that we're trying to provide kind of the right mix of things to satisfy different people. That's probably the easiest way to answer your question.
Must be challenging.
It is,
Yeah.
constantly,
Yeah, I can imagine.
especially with our resources.
All right. Okay, Ken, thank you so much. Yeah, we really
Thank you.
appreciate and give him a big hand. All right, so now we've got some dinner, so please help yourselves, and Ken is here to chat with you as much as you like. Thank you.